Well, she hated every minute of it. Thank you for watching my video, but you know what? It's time to get a VPN. I know you think you might not need it, but guess what? Everybody needs a VPN these days. And Steve repeals to get your Surfshark 4 extra months off of Surfshark VPN.
Hey babe, I just got us 4 months extra of Surfshark.
Again, go to surfshark.com/SerpentZA and use the code SerpentZA at checkout to get those 4 extra months. And now, back to the show. Now, the first thing she couldn't stand were the relentless blue skies. Now, I'm not joking here. It's something that takes getting used to. When you've been living in China your entire life, and you suddenly come to a country where there aren't all these factories spewing pollution into the air. I mean, look, China does have blue skies. You do see blue skies, but it's not as perpetual as you see in the West. America's open blue skies were a shock, and it took a while for her to get used to the fact that we didn't see a single day of smog, a single day of grey skies. The entire trip was blue skies, except for that one time it rained. The next thing that shocked her was the fact that the roads were free. I know it sounds weird, but we take it for granted. In China, every single kilometer of highway is a toll road. You have to pay when you get on the toll road. You also have to pay at your apartment, whether it's at a shopping mall, anywhere. There is no free parking in China. You can't park for free on the side of the road in the cities. You must pay. Everywhere you go, you have to pay. So the fact that we did the entire trip without paying a single toll blew her mind. But I must say the biggest thing that she hated about the USA were the rest stops. The fact that all these facilities were there for free for everybody to use. Clean bathrooms, stocked with toilet paper. In China, there is no toilet paper in public bathrooms. It's not there because it gets stolen, so you have to carry your own toilet paper with you. So the fact that there was free toilet paper everywhere, the fact that everything was clean, there were picnic areas, barbecue facilities for people to use, pet areas for you to let your dog relieve itself and to relax after a long trip, nature trails at some of these rest areas, and in many cases, Wi-Fi, vending machines and places to work and charge your laptops. I mean, not to mention that you can stay overnight in your car if you're tired, and the fact that it's all for free. She hated this, and I'm sure you can understand why she hated this. It's because it made her realize how far behind China is. I mean, the toilet paper thing especially. I mean, even in the most remote rest stops in Utah, the toilets were stocked with toilet paper. It sounds bizarre, but trust me, if you go to China, you will very quickly realize that these very basic things that most people take for granted, they don't exist. Now, of course, I'm being facetious. She loved America. She loved her visit. We had a great time. Her favorite part of the trip was when we were going through Colorado, up in the mountains, because it's just gorgeous up there. And you know what? Along the entire way, she was expecting to see drug addicts. She was expecting to see homeless people. She was expecting to see people getting shot, because that's what the Chinese news tells her. That's what Chinese media tells her. And you know what? We didn't see a single homeless person in the entire trip. We didn't see a single drug addict in the entire trip. And we didn't see a single person getting shot either. Shortly after she had arrived, she was talking to my wife about how she was afraid that people were going to be racist towards her. How she'd been warned that Chinese people are picked on, they're targeted for crime, they're beaten up, all of these kind of things, because that's what the Chinese media tells them. Guess what? Everybody was super friendly and polite towards her. She could not believe just how different the reality of America was from what she'd been told by social media and the CCP. You know, guys, every time I get out there and do a trip and travel around America, and once again reminded why it is that I chose America as my home. Because we all get caught up in the negativity in the news. I mean, everybody's got some problem. There's always something about how things are falling apart, or this political party, or this leader, or this person is bad, or this group is bad, or you know what, they're corrupting our kids, or whatever. You know, it gets to you and you start to become negative. But once you get out there and you see what an amazing country America really is, kind of wipes the slate clean. And being able to see through the eyes of my friend a fresh perspective, it once again reminded me that everything we see in the news, in social media, is hyped up and overblown. The negativity is focused on, and nobody's ever looking at the good stuff. And you know what? America is fantastic. And she's left America now with a very positive impression. I'm very glad that I got to show her around. Anyway, until next time, guys, you know the drill. As always, like the USA, stay awesome. So China is apparently ahead of the game. They've released a mosquito-sized drone, which is not only for surveillance, but it's going to take over the world and give them a massive advantage over the battlefield.
That's terrifying. Can you imagine a little mosquito flying around?
Nazis. They're essentially a synonym for evil. And, of course, no one's worse than Hitler. But the Japanese in World War II were every bit as horrific as the Germans, in many ways worse. Their military murdered prisoners for sport, raped hundreds of thousands of women and girls. They froze babies alive in human medical experiments. Yet few people even know the name of the prime minister who took them to war, Hideki Tojo. And his boss, Emperor Hirohito, He ended up going to Disneyland before he died. Imagine Goebbels in the teacups. I'm Ken LaCourte, and the elephant in the room is this. How did Japan boss Emperor Hirohito? He ended up going to Disneyland before he died. Imagine Goebbels in the teacups. I'm Ken LaCourte, and the elephant in the room is this. How did Japan escape the blame that Germany got for World War II? I've wondered about it for a long time, and I decided to dig in and see what I could learn. I'll take you through the horror we forgot, what Imperial Japan actually did in the war. Then we'll look at forgive and forget, unless you're a German. Then we'll try to understand the European war popularity, as well as take a look at two specific concepts, nuclear sympathy and Cold War realities, to see how they shaped what we remember and what we never heard about World War II. Let's first take a look at the Pacific theater of World War II, where Japan's war machine killed up to 30 million people, most of them civilians. It includes millions of Chinese civilians, POWs, Korean slaves, whole towns wiped out. But it's not just the numbers that are horrific, it's also what they did to people before they killed them. In 1937, Japanese troops rolled into China's capital and unleashed 6 weeks of sadism that we know as the Rape of Nanking. They held public beheading contests to see who could kill the fastest. Soldiers raped women in front of their families, then carved them open with bayonets. Pregnant mothers were gutted. Infants were thrown in the air and caught on swords. One witness described a girl, no older than 9, raped by more than 20 men in a single night and then impaled with a bamboo spear. Estimates say between 200 and 300,000 people were slaughtered. It was so awful that even Nazis stationed in the city wrote panicked reports back to Berlin begging someone to intervene. Think about that for a moment. And Nanking wasn't even the worst of it. In northeast China, Japan set up a secret facility called Unit 731. It ran from the mid-1930s to the end of the war. Inside, Japanese scientists, they dissected the victims alive with no anesthesia at different points during the disease to study its progression. They removed organs one by one to see how long a body could keep going. One case involved a frostbite experiment on a 3-day-old infant. Another used POWs to test flamethrowers and grenades. People's arms were frozen and shattered with hammers. Some prisoners were tied to stakes while plague bombs full of infected fleas were dropped overhead. And then, hundreds of thousands of people, mainly Chinese, died from the plague bombs developed by that unit. The lab also used Russians, Koreans, and American POWs as test subjects, and virtually none of them survived. On a broader level, the Japanese military essentially industrialized sexual slavery. Around 200,000 women, mostly Korean and Chinese, were kidnapped or tricked into becoming comfort women. They were raped dozens of times a day, beaten, and worse. There's evidence of teenagers with shattered pelvises, girls who died from infection, suicide, or simple exhaustion. One survivor described being forced to service 40 men in 24 hours. And if you were a soldier captured by the Japanese, the outcome wasn't much better. On the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who stumbled. Thousands died on the road. Those who made it to prison camps faced starvation, disease, beatings, and slave labor. Here's some perspective. The death rate for Allied POWs under Nazi control was about 4%. The death rate in Japanese custody? About 30%. And for Chinese soldiers, there were no POW camps at all because most were executed on the spot. Germany's gas chambers became a symbol of industrial evil, but Japan's crimes were more intimate, physical, even gleeful. And behind all of this brutality was a culture that worshipped death over surrender. In the Pacific, less than 1% of Japanese troops allowed themselves to be captured. They fought to the death or took their own lives because they believed it was better to die than be taken alive. That belief was so deep that in places like Saipan, civilian families, including mothers with their kids in their arms, jumped off of cliffs rather than be captured. They'd been told that the Americans would torture and rape them. We have a first-hand account of some of that torture from Louis Zamperini. He was an Olympic track star who became a bombardier in the Pacific. His plane went down, and he spent 47 days at sea before Japanese forces picked him up and threw him in a prison camp. It was known as Execution Island. He was routinely starved and beaten. A sadistic commander named Watanabe made it his mission to break Zamperini and others. He beat him daily, sometimes punching him unconscious. He starved and humiliated him. One day, he ordered every man in the camp to punch Zamperini in the face, over 200 times. Zamperini was freed at the end of World War II after 2 years in captivity, and his story was turned into a really amazing book called Unbroken. I have a link to that below. It was also turned into a movie directed by Angelina Jolie. And oh, by the way, if the US hadn't ended the war so quickly with atomic bombs, The Japanese had plans to murder every Allied POW in the country. And when it came to Japan, there essentially became a policy of forgive and forget, and most of the war criminals never faced any kind of reckoning. After the war, top Nazi leaders were dragged into court, paraded before the world, hanged. Swastikas and other Nazi symbols are still banned in Germany. And Japan did have some war trials, but that ended up executing 7 people, including Tojo. But by 1958, every other convicted war criminal was set free. And some of the worst offenders were never even tried. Watanabe, the POW commander who tortured Zamperini, he was listed as number 23 on General MacArthur's most wanted criminals list. That list was public, his crimes were known. But he hid out for a few years, then re-emerged in Japan as a free man, working in insurance. In 1998, he sat down for an interview where he didn't really feel sorry for anything, and he died at the age of 85 without ever seeing a hint of punishment. That was the pattern with a lot of the perpetrators. Unit 731's leadership was never prosecuted. In 1946, US intelligence struck a secret deal and the scientists and leaders got full immunity in exchange for their germ warfare research. The data was classified and later used as a foundation for the US bioweapons program. Emperor Hirohito, who presided over all of it, he got a pass as well. General MacArthur said that if the US arrested Hirohito, it would take 1 million troops to keep Japan from exploding. He also worried that the Soviets might fill the vacuum, so Hirohito stayed on the throne, never testifying or standing trial. And as I mentioned, in 1975, goodwill tour to the United States and had a great time at Disneyland. I remember my dad telling me how wrong that felt at the time, especially because he had friends who died in that war. That's my dad on the right, and actually Louis Zamperini on the left, who became his friend later in life. No German leader could have pulled off a US goodwill tour. Germany got never again, and the country spent decades apologizing, educating, and confronting its past. You can't walk through Berlin without stumbling into a memorial. But Japan got a clean slate. And it's not just the Japanese public that moved on. Our memories of Americans and others throughout the world have gotten fuzzy too. Hey, I researched this deeply, but I'm not perfect. If I made a mistake or left something important out, I'll correct it in the description box below. You can also find my source notes there as well. Okay, so what we remember often comes down to who tells the story. After World War II, for the American public, the main characters were in Europe. That was the war we recognized. I mean, the people were more culturally familiar, and the places were more recognizable to us. Also, the Allies made filming Nazi atrocities a top priority. Military photographers shot hours of footage at concentration camps. They showed piles of corpses, mass graves, gas chambers, and the living dead. Survivors told their stories on camera. The Allies recorded the horrors as evidence for war crimes and for our collective memory. But the Pacific Theater was different. It was jungle warfare with enemies that looked nothing like us. Photos and testimony from that time, they exist, but the original film footage is rare, and most of it shows a general aftermath, not the actual atrocities. Asian victims also didn't resonate the same way. Wartime propaganda dehumanized the entire region and race. Orientals was the term used to lump Chinese civilians and Japanese soldiers into one large, blurry category, and it dulled the outrage. Americans didn't see Asians as fellow Westerners under siege. They saw a different battlefield, filled with people they didn't understand and that they just didn't care as much about. For decades, US history books covered Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the atomic bombs in vivid detail. But we got maybe a sentence or two on Japanese aggression, even less about the horrors. Until the late 1990s, most Americans had never heard of Unit 731. When Iris Chang published The Rape of Nanking in 1997, it felt like a shocking expose because it was. The story had been missing from the syllabus for 50 years. Meanwhile, a foundation of World War II education. Every American student knows the name Auschwitz and Dachau, but hardly anyone knows Pingfang, the town where Unit 731 operated. Another factor to consider is that most of Hollywood's powerful studio heads were Jewish immigrants, some of them refugees. Telling the story of Nazi evil was personal. So we got dozens of European war movies, Holocaust films, documentaries, and memoirs. Entire genres were built around it. By contrast, Pacific War films were rarer. Movies like Empire of the Sun or Unbroken came decades later, but few had the impact of the European War, and there was certainly never an equivalent Schindler's List. And that leads us to nuclear sympathy, which helped Japan pull off a rare transformation from brutal empire to global victim. In August 1945, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, first on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered and died from radiation in the weeks that followed. Those bombs didn't just end the war, they rewrote the story of what happened beforehand. The images of charred schoolchildren, shadows of vaporized bodies, and burn victims stumbling through rubble, they were unforgettable. And the country that butchered its way through Asia became seen by many as the first victim of nuclear war. And Japan leaned into that hard. Once the US occupation ended, the Japanese government built a national identity around peace and atomic suffering. Every August, Hiroshima hosts a solemn ceremony with speeches, lanterns, doves. It's treated as a uniquely tragic event in world history, which it is. But it also overshadows what Japan did before 1945. Even visiting diplomats follow the script. They lay wreaths at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, but they rarely acknowledge Japan's horror. And inside Japan, that narrative stuck as well. Surveys show citizens are far more likely to recall the firebombings of Tokyo or the A-bomb attacks than any atrocities they committed. When tough questions come up about Unit 731, Comfort Women, Nanking, Japanese officials often pivot to Hiroshima, and it shifts the conversation from what we did to what was done to us. And as Cold War tensions rose, Japan's anti-nuclear stance, it won at moral points abroad. It became a pacifist model. And over time, Western guilt about the nuclear bombs meant that victories over Europe was celebrated more often than that over Japan. The end result is that the world remembers the ending of the war more clearly than it remembers the beginning and the terrible middle. But right after the war, why weren't more Japanese leaders prosecuted? Why did the emperor and so many others walk away free? It wasn't just niceness. The US was also becoming more strategic during the Cold War. After the surrender, America had to decide what kind of a Japan it wanted to help rebuild. Actually, at first, the US worked to demilitarize and democratize Japan. They held trials, purged generals, and they wrote a new constitution. But by 1947, the priorities had flipped. Communism was spreading fast, and Washington decided Japan was more useful as a stable ally rather than a punished enemy. Historians call it the reverse course. General MacArthur decided to protect the emperor, fast-track economic recovery, and stop arresting new war criminals. By 1948, the US stopped additional prosecutions altogether, and by the early 1950s, most prisoners were paroled. And behind the scenes, the US struck deals that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The Unit 731 scientists got immunity. The general who ran the unit was never punished, and some of his staff went on to become professors, researchers, and respected doctors. As I mentioned, the emperor was shielded, and a 1951 treaty forgave most reparations. A year later, a security pact made Japan a key American ally. Purged war criminals quietly returned to power. Men who'd overseen slave labor and war campaigns now ran ministries and banks. Nobusuke Kishi, once arrested as a Class A war criminal, became Japan's prime minister in 1957. Within a few decades, the world saw Japan as the land of Toyotas and Walkmans as memories faded. Japan's national broadcaster issued textbook guidelines that forbade the phrase, "the rape of Nanking." It was part of a decades-long battle over how the war would be remembered. Japan finally issued an apology in 1993, the Kono Statement, but it's been a political flashpoint ever since. Some Japanese leaders have walked it back, others have tried to erase it. A 2023 poll found that only 4% of Japanese under 30 years old had a correct estimate of the Nanking death toll. America cut deals and helped build a sanitized version of Japan's wartime history. One that was easy to work with and live with, and it worked. And look, it's not about keeping a scoreboard of evil, but there are millions of people who deserve to be remembered. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history in terms of absolute, but as a percentage of humanity who was killed, other wars throughout history were substantially worse. And one thing difficult to see right now is that even with our ongoing wars that seem so awful, and they are, we're living in perhaps the greatest era of peace that humanity has ever seen. This video may open your eyes to get a better, more hopeful understanding of what our world is like. Hey, I hope you got something useful out of this, and if you did, you come back for another one. Thanks for watching.
This is the country of Myanmar, sometimes also referred to as Burma, and it really only appears as a functioning country in our imagination on maps. When you look further inside, Myanmar is without exaggeration the most geopolitically complex country on the planet today, where it's extremely difficult for outsiders to figure out what's actually going on. The country has been completely consumed by a brutal, multi-sided civil war that has been going on for more than 4 years now, that has shattered the country into a complicated mosaic of competing militias, warlords, resistance fighters, and a totalitarian central regime dominated by the military that came to power during a coup d'etat in early 2021 that overthrew the previous democratically elected government. You may have seen memes about this coup back when it happened then, centering around this woman who was filming herself performing an aerobic dance routine as the country's military was busy storming and overthrowing the government right behind her. That coup is what triggered the current civil war in the country, and over the past 4+ years of fighting across Myanmar since then, more than 82,000 people have been killed, while more than 3.2 million others have been internally displaced, making the war that's still raging in Myanmar among the most violent and destructive active conflicts taking place anywhere in the world today, but also one that has only attracted a fraction of the international attention as the other ongoing major wars in Ukraine and Gaza have garnered. But Myanmar, a country of some 54 million people in the heart of Southeast Asia, is actively in the process of dying, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the rest of Asia and the world. Myanmar's economy has crashed by at least 20% since the civil war began. The central government now controls only about 1/5 of the country's territory and virtually none of its own international borders with its neighbors. In the mostly lawless periphery border regions beyond the government's control, massive drug dealing and the largest scam factories in the world taking up entire skyscrapers involving tens of thousands of people have been established. Governments from around the world have warned their citizens not to travel anywhere in Myanmar due to the persistent threat of getting caught up in the war there. And the country is now at a serious risk of balkanizing or fragmenting and becoming another Yugoslavia or another Afghanistan, but on an even larger scale. And it's already become what is essentially the only failed state in Eastern Asia located at the strategic crossroads between China, India, and the Bay of Bengal, with major consequences for everyone around them, especially China, who is becoming more and more forced to militarily intervene in the raging chaos that's going on immediately across from their southwestern border. To understand how Myanmar got to this point of potential state collapse today and to understand the severity of the potential consequences, it helps first to understand the series of events that led up to the coup and the civil war in 2021. Before 1989, the country was known as Burma, so that's the name I'll begin referring to it as for a bit from here. Burma, like many other places in the world, was steadily taken over by the British and ruled by them as a colonial possession for more than a century between 1824 and 1948. After Burma was eventually granted its independence by the British following the Second World War, it has consistently struggled with governing over its extremely diverse multi-ethnic society. Today, there are an astonishing 135 separate, distinct, recognized ethnic groups who are present in the country. The Bamar, whom the country's original name, Burma, derived from, have always made up the majority of the country's population, and today they represent around 68% of the total population, and dominate the center and most of the coast. The peripheries of the country, meanwhile, have always been populated by various ethnic minorities, with the largest being the Shan, Karen, Rakhine, Han Chinese, Mon, Indians, Kachin, and Chin. These minority groups in the country have always preferred to identify themselves as ethnic nationalities rather than ethnic minorities, because they've always, ever since the country's independence, been insecure and fearful about the political domination of the Bamar majority. To add an even further layer to the complexity, the overwhelming majority of Burma's society practices Buddhism, including most of the Bamar ethnic majority. But several of the minority ethnic groups predominantly practice either Christianity or Islam instead, like the Chin, Kachin, and Ken, who are predominantly Christians, and the Rohingya, who are predominantly Muslims. In the lead up to Burma's post-war independence, the country's chief independence leader named Aung San promised that some of these ethnic minority groups would be granted their full autonomy within their own territories within Burma, with a further option to secede from Burma after 10 years had passed. However, Aung San was assassinated merely months before the country's independence was granted, and so his promises of autonomy to the ethnic minorities were never honored by the post-independence government, which almost immediately sparked major rebellions by many of the ethnic minorities who began forming their own armed militias to resist the central government's authority, and they became known as Ethnic Armed Organizations, or EAOs for short, with goals ranging from increased autonomy within Burma to a federalized system within Burma, or even to full-blown independence. Many of these EAOs have been continually engaged in a state of conflict with the central government for more than 77 years ever since then, making the conflict in Myanmar the longest continually running war that is still ongoing in the world today. In 1962, the Burmese military, known as the Tatmadaw, launched a coup d'etat that overthrew the parliamentary government and installed a totalitarian dictatorship under a military junta in its place that would last for the next several decades. The Tatmadaw, dominated by the country's ethnic Bamar Buddhist majority, continued refusing to implement a federal system within the country and dramatically increased the state's repression of its ethnic minority regions, continuing and exacerbating the fighting between the state and the EAOs around the periphery. At the same time, the Tatmadaw military dictatorship pursued a radical policy within Burma that sought to completely isolate the country from the rest of the outside world economically. Trade and contact with the outside world was largely eliminated. Most industries were nationalized, and Soviet-style central planning was combined with traditional Buddhist beliefs and deep local superstitions. The result was unbelievable economic mismanagement and crippling poverty. By 1987, after more than a quarter century of totalitarian Tatmadaw rule, Burma was the second most impoverished country on the entire planet, remaining only just barely ahead of nearby Cambodia, who had lost more than a quarter of its population only a few years earlier under the infamous regime of Pol Pot. The year after, in 1988, the level of popular discontent within the country had risen high enough that it exploded into a massive nationwide uprising involving hundreds of thousands of people. The Tatmadaw regime responded with a brutal armed crackdown, likely killing thousands of protesters in the process. Even though the Tatmadaw ended up squashing the uprising through force and continued remaining in power, it also realized that it needed to begin adopting reforms to prevent the same kind of uprising from ever happening again. The Tatmadaw regime unilaterally changed the country's name from Burma to Myanmar just the next year in 1989, in an attempt to distance itself from the country's colonial past and to be more inclusive of the country's many diverse ethnic groups apart from the Bamar, though the name change has remained highly controversial ever since it was not decided democratically by a regime that seized power through force. The United States and several other countries around the world who do not recognize the country's military government as legitimate continue to insist on officially calling the country Burma instead, which is why on Google Maps and other apps you'll continue seeing the dispute marked by both names being displayed at once. To further show how serious they supposedly were about reforming the country, the Tatmadaw also agreed to host the country's first open election in nearly 3 decades in 1990 that they, for some reason, confidently believed they would actually win. Instead, a party known as the National League for Democracy, or the NLD, won decisively. The NLD was led by a woman named Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of Aung San, Myanmar's independence-era hero who had advocated for federalism in the country and was assassinated decades earlier. Shocked by her and the NLD's victory in the 1990 election, the Tatmadaw regime simply refused to recognize the results and placed Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest, which would last for much of the next 20 years for her until 2010. Over the years that followed, the Tatmadaw further consolidated their power in Myanmar and ramped up their attacks on the EAOs around the periphery, destroying most of their bases and strongholds by the mid-2000s and entering into ceasefire agreements with many of them. But the 1990 election results also showed the Tatmadaw just how unpopular they really were amongst the people they ruled over through force. And so to maintain their hold on power, they created what they called a roadmap to disciplined democracy that culminated in 2008 with their drafting of a new constitution. This new constitution, for the first time in Myanmar's post-independence history, created 5 self-administered zones and 1 self-administered division for 6 of the country's ethnic minority groups, reducing the need for many of them to continue fighting. The Wa state, home to the Wa ethnic minority group, was granted so much autonomy within Myanmar through the 2008 constitution that it effectively has functioned as a de facto independent state ever since, with its own completely separate and independent political system and army with no declared allegiance to any of the rest of Myanmar. The Tatmadaw also released thousands of their political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi, from her long house arrest, and agreed to host another round of elections again in 2010, 20 years after their last elections that they refused to recognize back in 1990. However, unlike the 1990 election that surprised them, they made sure that no matter how bad the results of the 2010 election were for them, they would continue remaining largely in power without having to resort to force. They wrote into the 2008 constitution that at least 25% of all the parliamentary seats in the government would still be reserved for the military. The military alone would continue controlling the country's security policy without any civilian oversight, while the military would also continue appointing one of the country's 2 vice presidents, essentially ensuring that the military could veto any proposed constitutional amendments going forward. To try and even further shape the election outcome, the military also just banned anyone who was married to a foreign national from running for president, which was basically just an attempt to block Aung San Suu Kyi from running again, who was married to a British citizen. Her party decided to boycott the 2010 election in protest as a result, and so the military's preferred party won the election instead, and they remained largely in power. A few years later, Myanmar hosted another general election in 2015 that Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, finally participated in for the first time in a quarter century, and, like in the 1990 election, they once again won with the people decisively. But this time, unlike the 1990 election, the Tatmadaw actually decided to recognize the results and cautiously agree to enter into a power-sharing arrangement with the NLD, giving up a bit of their absolute grip over the country for the first time in more than 53 years since the 1962 coup. Since Aung San Suu Kyi herself was still legally barred from running for office, she never became Myanmar's president. But after the election, they created a new position to give to her instead that they called the State Councillor, which made her the de facto leader of Myanmar anyway. It's hard to describe just how high the hopes were in the world for Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD's leadership in Myanmar after the 2015 election. There was a serious hope that after more than 50 years of continuous authoritarian military rule in the country, Suu Kyi was finally helping to transition the country towards democracy. But then, very quickly after her government began administrating things, the military decided to do something that captured the entire world's attention and severely undermined international trust in her government. The Rakhine State in the west of Myanmar across the border from Bangladesh has always been among the most unstable and violent regions in the country, stemming from its very high levels of ethnic and religious diversity. One of the largest groups of people present in the Rakhine State at the time were the Rohingya, one of the very few Indo-Aryan ethnic groups who predominantly practice the Islamic faith in the country. There used to be around 1 million Rohingya people who lived in the Rakhine State, but they've always faced enormous levels of persecution and disenfranchisement by the ethnic Bamar and Buddhist-majority Tatmadaw and the Myanmar government. The Myanmar government has continually maintained that the Indo-Aryan and predominantly Muslim Rohingya are not indigenous to the country, and that they were only brought over to settle in historic Burma by the British colonial government during the 19th century. The Rohingya themselves insist that their own history in the Rakhine State goes back thousands of years, but the Myanmar government refuses to even call them by their own name, officially calling them Bengalis instead to further discredit their right to live in the country. The government has asserted that the Rohingya are a product of British-era colonial settlement policies, and on that supposed basis, they stripped all of the 1 million plus Rohingya in the country of their citizenship back in 1982. Which has left the Rohingya as the largest stateless population in the world ever since. Further restrictions were placed on the Rohingya's freedom of movement and education access, which led to multiple academics and scholars calling the conditions faced by the Rohingya in the Rakhine State as similar to the apartheid policies experienced in South Africa. Understandably, the Rohingya launched multiple armed insurrections against the military and the government throughout the 1990s and 2010s in the face of this repression. And in October of 2016, an attack by one Rohingya militant group on a police station in the Rakhine State killed 12 Tatmadaw police officers, which led to the military deciding to retaliate with genocidal fury. The Tatmadaw immediately launched an overwhelming crackdown in the Rakhine State against the entire Rohingya community, killing more than 6,700 Rohingya in just a single month, burning down and destroying enough Rohingya villages that they were captured by satellites, and forcefully driving out more than 700,000 Rohingya across the international border into Bangladesh as refugees, representing most of Myanmar's entire Rohingya population and one of the 21st century's most egregious cases of ethnic cleansing. It's likely that tens of thousands of Rohingya were ultimately massacred by the Tatmadaw during this crackdown in 2017. And their forcing of hundreds of thousands of survivors into Bangladesh triggered the largest refugee crisis in Asia seen since the Vietnam War. where around 1 million stateless Rohingya refugees with no citizenship anywhere continue living in political limbo to this day in the largest refugee camps in the world. A couple of years later, in 2019, the Gambia, on behalf of all 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, introduced a legal case to the International Court of Justice accusing Myanmar of committing genocide against the Rohingya, which is still ongoing and has since been joined by many Western countries like the UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Denmark, and Canada. As Myanmar's state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi traveled to The Hague in December of 2019 to defend her country against the genocide charges, arguing to the dismay of many of her international supporters that while some war crimes have been committed by the military in the Rakhine state, no genocide of the Rohingya had actually taken place there. With her support from the West substantially eroded after making these arguments in International Criminal Court, Myanmar hosted another general election in November of 2020 that her NLD party once again won decisively for the second time in a row, leading the Tatmadaw military to begin growing concerned that the NLD's continued electoral success was posing a long-term threat to its own continued rule. So just like they did after the 1990 elections didn't go their way, the Tatmadaw just contested the 2020 elections as supposedly fraudulent. And then in February of 2021, they launched a full-blown coup against the civilian government that we began this video with, arresting dozens of the newly elected government officials before they could assume their positions and once again imprisoning Aung San Suu Kyi, who's remained in a mix of solitary confinement and house arrest for the past 4.5 years ever since. Almost immediately after the coup happened, protests against the violent seizure of power erupted in Myanmar's capital city, Naypyidaw, which the military characteristically responded to with overwhelming force, opening fire on the protesters with live ammunition and killing more than 600 people in the process. Thousands of politically motivated young people from the Bamar majority heartland of the country then fled into Myanmar's surrounding mountainous peripheries, where they linked up with many of the long-standing and heavily armed EAOs to receive training and weapons, before returning back to the heartland again to engage in ambushes and partisan warfare against the restored military junta in the country, which catapulted Myanmar into a state of full-blown civil war. The junta responded with massive violence, launching airstrikes and military operations across the whole country against the resistance, and installed one of their own generals, Min Aung Hlaing, as the regime's de facto leader and acting president. Within a few months, the motley collection of forces opposed to the military regime, including ousted elected officials, pro-democracy protesters, and long-oppressed ethnic minorities, banded together and formed the National Unity Government, or NUG, with the officially stated goal of removing the military from power and establishing a fully federalized democratic Myanmar in its place. Within time, the NUG established its armed wing called the People's Defense Force, or PDF, to fight against the junta and their allies in the country, which by 2024 would grow to encompass an estimated 85,000 soldiers. Over time, many of the 25 active and heavily armed EAOs around the periphery of the country, many of which have thousands of their own soldiers, began breaking their ceasefires with the government and aligning themselves with the pro-democracy forces in the country against the junta as the junta began losing ground, while a few other of the EAOs, for a variety of reasons, aligned themselves with the military instead. Beginning in late 2023, the Tatmadaw began experiencing an increasingly high number of military setbacks and loss of territory. As of mid-2025, the Tatmadaw only maintains its control over about 1/5 of Myanmar's territory, and has lost control over most of the country's external international borders, though it still dominates the Bamar heartland in the center of the country that is the most densely populated part of Myanmar with all of the most major cities. The PDF and the EAOs have consistently struggled with taking over major cities in the country during the Civil War, and so while they currently control more territory than the regime does, most of it is sparsely populated rural countryside. Throughout the past 4+ years of war here, Western countries have largely ignored what's been going on, largely disillusioned with Myanmar's pro-democracy movement following Aung San Suu Kyi's defense of the military's genocide against the Rohingya, and distracted by other large-scale conflicts closer to home like Ukraine and Gaza. But in the absence of large-scale Western involvement in the conflict, China stepped onto the scene in Myanmar to fill the vacuum and has become by far the most influential outside power here, working together with both the military junta and various rebel factions at the same time to advance their own interests. Myanmar is one of the most important countries right now for China's geopolitical calculus, and Beijing's interests in the country are numerous. It is the only country that directly borders China that is experiencing a major war on its own territory. And so naturally, China would be concerned about ensuring stability along the entire length of their border that stretches and winds for nearly 2,100 kilometers. China is also highly concerned about suppressing any potential Western influence in Myanmar, represented the most by the NUG and the pro-democracy resistance in the country. There isn't a single country who directly borders China that is explicitly pro-Western right now, and China would like to keep it that way. A pro-Western government in power in Myanmar would become an outpost of Western influence on China's southwestern flank, with potentially disastrous consequences for China's strategic planning regarding an invasion of Taiwan. For this reason, China has primarily supported the Tatmadaw military regime in power in the country, but has also supported a whole host of rebel EAOs at the same time who are not ideologically committed to democracy, undermining the NUG and the pro-democracy resistance while keeping Myanmar chronically unstable between the Tatmadaw and the EAOs, neither of which have proven capable of decisively defeating the other over the years since they both received China's support in different ways at different times. From Beijing's perspective, the most ideal government in power in Myanmar would be pro-Chinese, like the Tatmadaw has often been. But barring that, their next most preferable option would be an unstable Myanmar that cannot effectively push China's influence out. And the least preferable option would be a fully democratic federalized Myanmar that would probably grow closer to the West and undermine China's strategically critical influence and investments in the country. What are these strategically critical Chinese investments in the country? Look no further than the oil and gas pipeline that they helped construct across Myanmar between 2009 and 2014 at a cost of billions of dollars. These two pipelines are known as the Sino-Myanmar pipelines, and they were built as a part of China's greater worldwide Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure program. Myanmar's territory is critical to China for these pipelines, because they provide China with a gateway into the Indian Ocean, and most importantly, they provide China with an alternative energy import route to the Strait of Malacca. Roughly 95% of China's energy imports currently travel into the country by sea, largely on the backs of tankers coming from the oil and gas-rich Persian Gulf as well as Russia. 80% of China's energy imports are currently forced by geography to funnel themselves through the narrow Strait of Malacca on their way to Chinese ports, a critical choke point that could become blockaded by the US Navy in the event of a war breaking out over Taiwan. Such an action would immediately eliminate the majority of China's energy imports required to sustain itself. So for decades, China has been busy building out alternative energy import routes to get around the Malacca Strait problem. And the Sino-Myanmar pipelines are some of these most important alternatives. They begin at the deepwater port of Kiakpu on the island of Ram Ri on Myanmar's coast, and then travel for nearly 2,500 kilometers across the whole country through mountainous and jungle-covered terrain before crossing over the border into China, where they continue extending towards the major city of Kunming, the capital and the largest city of China's southern Yunnan province. Financially, these twin oil and gas pipelines cut off about 3,000 kilometers and 5 to 6 days worth of travel time for energy resources to reach China's coasts, saving considerable money on transportation costs. But more importantly, they also enable China to import at least some amount of oil and gas without having to rely on shipping through the vulnerable Strait of Malacca. While the pipelines don't have enough capacity to support the whole of China's energy needs, they are probably enough to support at least southern China's regional needs, and they are still better than absolutely nothing. In 2019, the oil pipeline was able to provide roughly 7 to 8% of China's total crude oil imports, while the gas pipeline was able to provide about 2.6% of China, well below its total capacity for years now. If China is eventually able to get it operating at its full capacity, it could provide more than 20% of China's total gas imports instead. Together, the pipeline significantly reduced China's strategic exposure to its Strait of Malacca vulnerability, which gives China much more strategic flexibility when it comes to a potential assault on Taiwan. These pipelines running across Myanmar are therefore extremely valuable pieces of strategic infrastructure to China, and they represent China's biggest single interest and risk in the country. China wants to guarantee the security of these pipelines, but they run through several sections of Myanmar currently under both rebel and junta control that are experiencing heavy armed fighting. Despite this, however, throughout the entire past 4 years of war in Myanmar, the pipelines have remained almost completely untouched by anyone, because neither the junta nor any of the rebels they're fighting against want to incur China's wrath by ever touching them. The pipelines both begin at the port of Kiakpu and then travel through Myanmar's Rakhine state first on their way to China. But the Rakhine State is currently almost completely controlled by one of the rebel EAOs fighting against the junta, the Arakan Army, or AA. The AA is currently besieging the port of Hyokpyu, still under tenuous junta control for now where the pipelines both begin at. The AA has an estimated 50,000 fighters under their command currently, and they've been fighting against the junta to try and establish a similar status for themselves in the Rakhine State as exists in the Wa State. That is, a de facto independent state with complete autonomy inside Myanmar. In the entire history of the Myanmar conflict, going back to the country's independence, the central government has never before faced the prospect of a rebel faction coming so close to controlling the entirety of one of the country's states. And while you might think that China would be concerned about that since it's where their pipelines begin at, they're not really, because they've actively pursued friendly relations with both the AA and the junta alike. Both the junta and the AA have promised China that they won't deploy heavy weaponry around the pipelines, while both the junta and the AA have also allowed China to deploy their own mercenaries to Hyokpyu as of February 2025 in order to defend the entrance to their pipelines, which all on its own is a breathtaking development in this war. Only days before their deployment, the junta in Myanmar passed a new law that for the first time allowed foreign military personnel to operate within the country, but only under the guise of mercenaries. Chinese soldiers deployed to Myanmar only have to resign from their positions in the PLA before assuming their new mercenary roles, which effectively establishes a de facto Chinese military deployment to Myanmar without any of the diplomatic complications that might arise from a more public official deployment. The move has essentially created a Chinese version of the Russian Wagner Group, the state-owned mercenary company that Russia was able to deploy to theaters like Ukraine and Syria while maintaining plausible deniability. Now, for the first time, Chinese mercenaries are actively on the ground in Myanmar as well, with the explicit goal of defending China's pipelines in the country from the chaotic war that is raging all around them. The pipeline extends further through junta-controlled territory in the Bamar heartland in the center of the country, where it's come under rebel attacks on at least 2 separate occasions previously in February of 2022 and then again in May of 2023. But since then, the rebels have refrained from attacking the pipelines again, aware that China largely controls the flow of their ammunition and weapon supplies crossing over the porous border via proxy groups. As the pipelines continue progressing through Myanmar, they travel across the Shan State next before ultimately entering into China. These days, the Shan State is a complicated, largely lawless thunderdome of various warring EAOs, pro-democracy rebels, warlords, criminal syndicates, and the junta. A dangerous area for China's critical pipelines to travel through. Probably worried about this early on, the Tatmadaw junta attempted to prove to China that they had their best interests at heart by placing landmines along the approaches to the pipelines to prevent any potential sabotage. But now, the pipelines run almost entirely through rebel-held territory in the Shan State all the way from the Bamar homeland right up to the Chinese border, meaning that both ends of the pipelines in Myanmar where they begin and where they enter China are currently under rebel control. This is also a fairly recent development though. And just like in the Rakhine State, where China largely cooperates with the local EAOs, China cooperates with the local EAOs in the Shan State as well. In periphery areas where the junta's armed forces were stretched thin, such as in the Shan State, they relied on hiring private militias and border guard forces to fight against the resistance instead. Low on cash though, the junta essentially just allowing them to open up drug trades and establishing enormous criminal enterprises like sketchy casinos and online scam factories that mostly targeted people in China. The scale of these scam factories set up in the lawless frontiers of the Shan State are difficult to comprehend, especially if this is the first time you're ever hearing about them. Entire high-rise buildings were set up from nothing in the remote, lawless jungles full of trafficked people smuggled in from all around the world and forced to work against their will in various crypto scams, online dating frauds, Instagram and Facebook deepfakes, and more. By 2023, the UN estimated that some 120,000 people had been trafficked and imprisoned in these massive scam factories across Myanmar. Primarily targeting Chinese nationals, these Myanmar scam factories drained billions of dollars out of the Chinese economy. And in October of 2023, dozens of these trafficked people, some of whom were undercover Chinese agents, managed to stage an escape from one of these scam factories in the city of Ko King, and were then shot at by the scam factory's guards, resulting in several of them getting killed. Growing frustrated with the Tatmado's inability or refusal to shut these mega scam factories down that were now killing Chinese nationals, China likely gave the green light to a coalition of rebel factions known as the Three Brotherhood Alliance to launch an offensive against them in order to clear the scam factories out. This offensive became known as Operation 1027, named after the date that it was launched on October 27th of 2023. And to the surprise of almost everyone, including China, it quickly began steamrolling the junta. Thousands of the Tatmado's soldiers simply surrendered or deserted, and hundreds of the junta's positions collapsed. By the summer of 2024, the Brotherhood managed to capture the city of Lashio, with a population of around 100,000 people, the largest city to ever fall into the hands of an EAO in Myanmar's entire post-independence history. By that point, China feared the forces that they themselves had unleashed and worried that the Tatmadaw regime was on the verge of collapse, potentially leading to unpredictable consequences, including China's worst-case scenario of a pro-Western government coming to power in the country. In an attempt to try and restore its control over the conflict and to ensure the security